Opening the English, white immediately claims a central foothold and prepares to challenge black's space. Immediately establishing flexible central influence, this knight's development prepares for a rapid pawn advance or to support an island of pawn control. Developing the knight here stakes a claim in the center and prepares a pawn push, a solid but standard response. Black prepares to fianchetto the bishop, creating diagonal pressure and a robust kingside defense. Solidifying the kingside structure, white prepares for a fianchetto to contest the long diagonal, subtly increasing central influence. Developing the dark-squared bishop to g7 establishes a classic fianchetto, aiming to control the long diagonal and prepare for castling kingside. Solidifying the fianchetto, white prepares to castle and potentially target the d5 square. Securing the monarch immediately prioritizes safety, a fundamental principle in this fianchetto setup. Developing the knight to its natural outpost reinforces central control and prepares for queenside expansion. This pawn push boldly contests the center, creating a more dynamic pawn structure for black and preventing white's pieces from easily infiltrating. Securing the king's safety becomes paramount, initiating a strategic retreat that also prepares for central pawn advances or potential pawn breaks in the queenside. Asserting central presence, this development efficiently occupies a key square, preparing to challenge white's space and potentially launch counterplay through d5. Challenging the center's stability, white immediately opens lines and aims to exploit the kingside pawn structure's potential. Solidifying the central pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn pushes is a fundamental aspect of this Kings-Indian setup. This allows black to contest the d4 square and explore pawn breaks like e5. Opening up the d-file for potential rook activity, white immediately challenges black's pawn structure, aiming to gain central space and tempo by forcing a recapture, potentially leading to a more open game where piece activity and initiative will be paramount. Reclaiming the pawn immediately resolves the central tension, creating an open position where piece development becomes paramount. Developing the bishop here creates immediate pressure on black's queenside pawn structure, aiming to exploit the semi-open c-file and potentially disrupt black's coordination. Steering the knight towards the central d5 outpost solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares for potential queenside expansion or even a kingside attack, creating a more flexible setup. Repositioning the queen to c1 liberates the c3 knight, enabling it to potentially jump to b5 or a4, and also prepares for future pawn pushes on the queenside. A bold maneuver, aiming to disrupt white's center and exploit the open d-file for potential piece activity. Black sacrifices a pawn for dynamic compensation, hoping to generate a swift kingside attack or gain a central outpost. This move injects tactical possibilities and demands careful calculation from white, as the pawn structure is now irrevocably altered. Reclaiming the open file, white signals an intention to contest the d-file directly, preparing to challenge black's centralized knights and potentially activate the rook to pressure the kingside. Instantly seizing central real estate, this pawn thrust dramatically alters the pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's queen's influence and gain a foothold for black's pieces. It's a bold assertion, challenging the established order and opening up possibilities for further piece activity, particularly on the kingside. Initiating a direct assault on black's kingside, the bishop repositions itself to a square that, while active, potentially exposes it to future exchanges or dislodging. This aggressive maneuver aims to disrupt black's harmonious setup, particularly targeting the weakened dark squares around the castled monarch and creating immediate tactical complications. Observe how this bishop's new perch influences the diagonal pressure and the potential for future piece sacrifices. The queen gracefully shifts, unburdening the d4 knight and preparing to exert pressure along the a5-e1 diagonal, potentially targeting the white king's safety. Sacrificing the bishop for pawn structure disruption, white aims to cripple black's kingside pawn chain and seize control of the now isolated d6 square, while potentially opening lines for future pressure. Capturing the bishop with your king, though seemingly forced, immediately exposes your monarch to potential attacking avenues along the newly opened light squares and the H-file. This decision prioritizes material parity over king's safety, a gamble that could prove costly if white can quickly mobilize their pieces towards your vulnerable king position. Consider how you will bolster your king's defense and contest the central light squares in the coming moves. Securing the king's escape route from the center's potential storms, this maneuver gracefully prepares for a more active rook lift or even a queenside expansion, subtly reinforcing white's central presence without outright confrontation just yet. Pivoting the rook to b8 initiates a strategic maneuver, aiming to challenge white's potentially dominant central control by activating the b-file and preparing for subsequent pawn pushes. Initiating a knight maneuver to centralize its influence and potentially support a future e4 pawn push, while also clearing the way for the rook to potentially access the c-file. A strategic pawn reinforcement, though a pawn now shores up the b5 outpost and prepares for potential queenside expansion, or simply discourages immediate knightly incursions from white's bishop on e3. Unlocking the queenside now with e3 establishes a flexible pawn structure, ready to support a kingside advance or a queenside expansion, while preparing to reintegrate the bishop that retreated to d2, aiming for better central control and avoiding any immediate weaknesses. Unleashing the knight's power, 16. e6 aims to reposition this piece to a more active square, potentially eyeing the d4 square or even the f4 outpost, while simultaneously shoring up the e5 pawn and preparing for potential pawn advances. Embracing an aggressive advance, white plants a pawn on a4 to contest the queenside expansion and potentially create weaknesses in black's pawn structure, aiming to disrupt its harmony and gain space for maneuverability. Initiating an aggressive pawn advance on the kingside, this maneuver injects immediate dynamism, seeking to pry open lines against the white monarch and create potential attacking avenues through the newly created pawn chain. Pondering an aggressive pawn push, white opens lines on the kingside, potentially creating weaknesses around black's monarch while simultaneously bolstering his own space. Embarking on a bold pawn thrust, black aims to destabilize white's central structure and pry open the f-file, creating immediate attacking prospects against the king. Probing for weaknesses, this knight foray into the d5 square immediately challenges black's pawn structure and eyes the vulnerable e7 outpost, potentially disrupting the harmonious development black has carefully cultivated. The knight's presence there creates a positional hook, forcing black to consider how to defend or dislodge this advanced piece, which might lead to concessions elsewhere. Securing the monarch behind a pawn shield becomes paramount, even if it feels slightly passive, as the e5 pawn now looks a bit strained and white's knight on d5 eyes the weakened squares. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing to contest the crucial queenside majority, this move aims to restrict black's active pieces and potentially generate play along the b-file. A cunning repositioning of the rook, aiming to free the g-file for the g7 bishop and potentially establish a more commanding presence on the 7th rank, all while maintaining flexibility should black decide to advance the f-pawn further. A subtle repositioning, the knight retreats from the skirmish on d5, seeking a less contested square where it can potentially support an e4 advance or defend against black's aggressive pawn thrusts. The queen repositions, seeking a more active square and eyeing the queenside where white's pieces seem a bit clustered, potentially aiming to support a pawn push on the b-file or a future break on the c-file. Reorienting the queen to the queenside aims to contest the open c-file and perhaps support a future advance there, but it relinquishes the central queen's influence and potentially leaves the d-pawn vulnerable. Abandoning the queenside's active potential, black shifts the focus towards the king's safety, a prudent if somewhat passive redirection after white's recent pawn advance. Suddenly injecting a pawn into the center dramatically alters the central pawn structure, aiming to seize more territory and potentially open lines for white's pieces. This advance carries inherent risk, as it might overextend the pawn chain if black responds aggressively and could become a target for counterplay. Liberating the e-pawn finally creates an open line for the rook and frees up the f7 square for potential piece redistribution, even if it temporarily weakens the central pawn structure and grants white's knight a more comfortable outpost. Recentralizing the knight, 24. ND2 offers a flexible regrouping, preparing to potentially support a pawn push on the king side or swing towards the queen side, subtly shifting white's focus from the center where black's pawn structure is now fragmented. Recentering the queen to the G7 square offers a defensive haven and prepares to support the f-pawn's advance, aiming to create dynamic counterplay on the king side after the recent pawn exchange. Unleashing a knight from its defensive post creates a dynamic tension, forcing a reevaluation of black's cramped king side and potentially opening lines for white's initiative. Securing the monarch behind a pawn shield and potentially preparing a RF8 maneuver to bolster the king's defenses, this repositioning emphasizes passive prophylaxis rather than immediate counterplay. Reasserting pressure on the d-file, this maneuver aims to dislodge black's knight from its potentially disruptive d4 perch and open lines for the rook. A strategic maneuver to consolidate the rook and prepare for a potential central pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. Securing the queenside pawn chain by advancing the pawn solidifies white's control over the b4 square, preventing black's knight from establishing a strong outpost there, and simultaneously restricting the mobility of black's rook on b8. This is a bold maneuver, directly challenging white's central pawn structure and aiming to exploit the open diagonal created by the bishop exchange, potentially liberating black's queenside and forcing white into a defensive posture to protect their exposed king. The flank pawn push aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially open lines for the rook, but it might overextend and create weaknesses on the light squares if black can exploit the subsequent pawn advances. Embracing the chaos, black accepts the pawn structure alteration, betting on the dynamic possibilities that emerge from the shattered pawn chains, even if it means accepting a slightly less cohesive center. White reclaims the central square, forcing black's queen to a less active diagonal and preparing to exploit the newly opened queen's file. Reigniting the initiative, black boldly advances the knight to the 5th rank, threatening to infiltrate white's queenside and disrupt the harmony of piece placement. Reinforcing the central occupation becomes paramount, preventing black's knight from further infiltrating while preparing to challenge the d-file. The black knight establishes a potent outpost on d4, a square previously eyed by white's own cavalry, disrupting white's queenside pawn structure and offering excellent prospects for future tactical skirmishes, potentially targeting the weakened light squares around white's monarch. Re-establishing a solid pawn structure and preparing to challenge black's central influence is the immediate goal here, aiming to untangle white's pieces. Sensing an opening to finally pry loose that stubborn knight on d4, black initiates a dynamic pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed central pawn chain and potentially create an outpost for their own knight. Heralding a daring repositioning, this queen gambles on infiltrating black's queenside, aiming to exploit the now weakened pawn and potentially disrupt coordination, while simultaneously retreating from the central pressure that might arise if black were to advance the f-pawn further. A knight's bold leap to d4 seeks to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and re-establish a mobile attacking piece, potentially eyeing the weakened b3 pawn or even aiming to reroute to a more active square if the position opens. A subtle repositioning aims to activate the rook from its passive placement, potentially contesting the b-file or providing defense on the 2nd rank, a flexible adjustment that acknowledges the blocked pawn structure and seeks to improve piece harmony without an immediate tactical fireworks. The knight's repositioning to c6 aims to reinforce the pawn chain and potentially reroute to d4 again, but it concedes valuable central space and allows white's queen to exert more pressure on the queen side. Reclaiming the vital b-file and preparing a potential breakthrough with the rook establishes a strong central presence, aiming to disrupt black's rather passive development and pressure any weaknesses that might arise. A daring excursion to the d4 square, seemingly unprovoked after the repetition, aiming to disrupt white's established queenside structure and potentially provoke pawn weaknesses, but it risks becoming a stranded piece if white can effectively consolidate. Unlocking the c-file offers a strategic advantage, challenging black's queenside structure and probing for weaknesses in the pawn chain. Sensing white's queen poised for an aggressive advance on the queen side, black decisively intervenes by attacking the central knight, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and create potential counterplay. Prying open the queen side with the knight's advance creates immediate pressure on black's otherwise solid pawn structure. Sacrificing material for initiative, black disrupts white's queenside setup and aims to exploit the newly opened lines.